Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today I want to talk about something that was presented in a Dark Horse podcast. That is the Brett Weinstein channel. And if you don't know it, check it out because they're excellent. Now, they are biologists, and I do actually really love the channel, despite the fact that biology is not necessarily my favorite topic. But the reason why I love their podcast, I love their YouTube channel, is because of their passion for the scientific method. And I don't always agree with them. They might come to a conclusion that I disagree with. But what I love about their channel is that it's all about the method of science and not necessarily committing to a result from the scientific method, but to the method itself. And also being able to present science in a way that can help other people become passionate about it. And I think that that really shows through in what they talk about. So you can have a disagreement with the conclusions they come to or the thoughts that they come to, and that is welcome on their channel, right? We don't always have to think the same. But we can all at least start at the same place of, I have this idea, I have this hypothesis, and I need to test it. This is the mechanisms, this is the method, this is how the process goes for testing an idea. And then when you get the result from it, how do you know it's authentic? How do you know it is without error, right? What's the control of error? And then when you do come to a result, we can all have different opinions about the result, and we might go in different directions from the result. And so this idea of the scientific method is really at the heart of what Montessori is. And I kind of think that the Dark Horse podcast really exemplifies the scientific education that Maria Montessori was trying to bring into the world. And so if you want to see an excellent example of scientific education, not just when I say scientific education, I don't mean teaching children about science. I mean the method in which we as teachers present information to our students. And that's really important. So when I talk about scientific education, I'm not talking about getting kids involved with STEAM or STEM or getting them involved in science. I'm talking about how we use science as teachers to develop our education system and to develop our teaching mechanisms and procedures. And I think that the Dark Horse podcast really focuses a lot on the method of science, because when you focus on the method of science, you're open to the possibilities, whatever they might be. But if you're committed to a result, you've compromised the scientific method. And so bringing it back to the foundations of, we can't compromise the scientific method just to manufacture a result. And when you have that as your goal, everything else becomes open again. Everything else becomes able to be discussed again. All ideas are back on the table, right? And that's what I like about the Dark Horse podcast. Now, I don't want to go too much further into this rabbit hole, but I did just watch a video by them that talked about textbooks. And they had this short clip from live stream 129 that said, no idea is trustworthy because it's written in a textbook. And if you haven't watched that video, go ahead and watch it. It looks like it's 13 minutes long. I'm not going to show it here, but I'll put the link down in the description and possibly in the comment section so that you have access to it, so you don't have to search all over. So I will put the link in there. So go and watch it and explore their ideas of what a scientific education is and how we should be approaching science in general. And I think that that is a really interesting discussion that they had. And the reason why I thought that this was a really good topic is because a lot of people don't know much about Montessori education. So I wanted to put together a quick video on the topic of textbooks, because that seems to be a big concern by parents nowadays. What textbooks do we include, and how do we know that they're trustworthy, right? So do we use textbooks in Montessori? The very, very short answer is no. But I'm never going to give you the really, really short answer, am I? I'm going to go for the long answer here. So the longer answer is maybe, possibly, yes, in certain contexts or in certain age groups, but mostly no. There is no specific textbook in the Montessori curriculum. So when I went to training for AMI, Montessori training, AMI is the most authentic Montessori training there is out there. It is the AMI organization was created by Maria Montessori herself, and has been protected pretty much by her family, her son Mario Montessori after her. And so it's really probably the most authentic training you can go to for Montessori. So in that training, there are no textbooks. There are textbooks for me. I have to read all of Montessori's work, but we don't do a textbook for children. So let me go a little bit further into what Montessori is, how we educate children without necessarily a textbook. And then maybe you'll have a clearer idea. And at the end, I'm going to give you some questions to think about or to ask a Montessori program. If you're looking into a Montessori program, maybe some questions about what you can ask the Montessori school so that you get a little bit more clarity on how they get their information to present to children. So let's move forward. So Montessori is based on Maria Montessori's philosophy and materials. I'm going to emphasize the word materials here. Maria Montessori did not write textbooks for children. She created materials. And teachers, like me, only read her books during training, We don't just only read her books during training. I probably could have worded that better. But basically what that means is that we're not focusing on lots of other philosophies during our Montessori training. We're reading her books with some exceptions. One I didn't put in here is Mario Montessori wrote some pamphlets as well. I don't think he ever wrote a book per se, but he does have some writings out there. And then Paula Polk Lillard, her books are considered part of Montessori curriculum for teachers, and then EM Standing. So they're kind of the exceptions to that. So when I go to training, I'm studying Montessori philosophy, and I'm studying her materials. Nothing else. It's all about her work. So this is kind of different than early childhood education or general public school education, where you're kind of getting this variety of different theories, right? And so Montessori allows the guide or the teacher, so a lot of times when I say guide, I'm referring to the teacher, allows the guide to bring in literature. All literature choices are based on the school system, administration, and the guide. There are no official Montessori textbooks or book materials that are required in a classroom. So the choices you see in the classroom, from my experience, are usually personally the guide's choice. And then it's really, a lot of the time, the administration doesn't really have a lot to do with it. From my experience, there might be schools out there that are very involved with what books you put in the classroom. And of course, there's always the school board. So if there is a curriculum that the school board and the administration is really committed to, like this, I shouldn't say a curriculum, but maybe an additional curriculum outside of Montessori, they can bring that in, right? That would be their choice. But a lot of the times when you see the books in the classroom, they are picked by the guide themselves. It's a very personal choice. And I haven't worked at a school that's really strong-armed a teacher into putting certain books in their classroom. That's not experience I've had. So from my experience, it's usually the guide who makes the decision what books go in a classroom. So Montessori encouraged art and classical literature, and she wanted those things even at the primary level. She really wanted to have the best quality of art and literature, even for young children. And before the age of 6, she said that books should be based on reality, not fantasy. And if you want to understand more about that, I have a video on imagination on my channel, so look that up. And that goes deeper into why this is. She encouraged real photos, and she said they should be used real photos should be used before the age of 6, not cartoons or drawings. So that's why when you go into a Montessori classroom, particularly an AMI classroom, before the age of 6, you're not going to see cartoony books, and you're not going to see real fantastical books. There might be some in there that we might read after the work cycle, and this is where I have a little bit of conflict because I do love like books like Where the Wild Things Are, right? Some classic books like that, or the Dawn and Audrey Woods books like The Napping House, right? There's some fantastic books out there that are more fantasy based, but in the classroom, we really try to stick with those scientific books, the books that show real photos, the books that show scientific phenomenon or help the child understand the world outside the classroom. We really want to give them the impression of the outside world to help them adapt from being in this protective small environment and help them transition to the larger environment outside of the classroom as they get older. So that there's a lot more to be said on that. But again, go back to my video on imagination and fantasy and you can go deeper into that idea. So anyways, those are the types of books you're going to see before the age of 6. And like I said, I still make room for some of the greater, more iconic books after the work cycle, after the 3-hour work cycle, because I do treat books as a work of art. And I think if we can display art to the children like Van Gogh, I do think there's room to have artistic books in the classroom at certain times, maybe not during the work cycle, but at certain times during the day. I think that I personally consider certain books to be works of art. Some I consider to be more works of science, and some I just consider to be absolutely terrible. That's kind of my 3 categories of books before the age of 6. So anyways, those are the types of books you'll see in the 0 to 6 age group. Now, Montessori teaches scientific method through experience, not through textbook. So when we talk about the scientific education that Montessori created, one of the big things is that we're going for experience here. We are experiencing the scientific method. We're not just learning what is the scientific method. We're actually experiencing it through the work. And in elementary, instead of textbooks, they do the great stories. And these are stories that the guide will tell orally, and they will present stories like the formation of the earth and other topics. And I don't have a lot of experience with this. I've taught in an elementary Montessori classroom before, but my experience with this is very, very limited, so I'm not able to really give you a good idea of what all of those are about. I've had very limited experience with those. So instead of a formal textbook, we have in the teacher training, we are taught these great stories. And those get passed on to the children. And then outside of those great stories, again, very much like primary, the guide brings in the books that they think are really helpful. They bring in resources, and the children can go to the resources that fascinate them the most. So there isn't one set book. They can even bring books in from home. They're interested in science, a particular subjects in science, let's say conductors, or anything in chemistry, right? Let's say there's a topic in chemistry that's really interesting to them, or ecology, any of those topics. The child can even bring books in from home. They can go to the library, and they can do a science project on a topic of their choice. And they can bring in the materials that they want to use. Perhaps a parent helps them find a book that they really think is important, and they can bring that into the classroom and work in that type of a setting. So it's a very flexible environment for how you obtain the materials. So AMI Montessori is, or at least was, a scientific education. You know, there's a lot of transformations over the years. We've had a few generations of teachers go through the program and go through the organization. And as everything, it evolves, right? But ideally, what you do during teacher training is You learn the materials and you learn the theory behind the materials. You learn the history of how Montessori developed her theories. You learn how to observe students scientifically through observation, and that means objective versus, made a typo there, objective versus subjective, that's supposed to say. So you're learning the difference between observations that are objective and subjective. You know, which ones are more opinion-based, which ones are more interpretive, and which ones are strictly behavioral. What do you actually see going on, and what are you actually interpreting? You also are taught how to use charts for individual behavior as well as whole room behavior. And if you're interested in this, I would absolutely love to do a video at some point in time about scientific observation in the Montessori environment. So if that's something you're interested in, comment below, and I will try to put together a video covering that so that you have a better idea how to become a scientific observer for either your classroom or for your homeschool environment. So when you go to teacher training, you also learn the theory of development according to Montessori. And if you're curious about what that looks like, I'm currently doing a video series on the Absorbent mind that covers all of this. It's really the big comprehensive guide. So I'm just working on chapter 7 right now. So if you're interested in that, see that series. I'm doing one chapter at a time for one video, so it's going to take a while to get through it. So when it comes to what's in the Montessori environment that the child is allowed to use, if we're talking about books, textbooks, materials, what is included, right? How do I know what's going to be in that environment? So this gets tricky. And this is why it's really important to understand, if you're looking at a Montessori program, what the teacher's training is. Because if the teacher's training is not very authentic to Montessori, you're going to see a lot of deviations from what Montessori actually created or what she actually taught to her teachers that she was training. So it's important to also note that Montessori did not copyright, trademark, or patent her name or works. She really wanted her materials, her ideas out there in the world. This is why you may see a variety of methods. This is also why you may notice that no two Montessori schools are alike. So when it comes to Montessori, anybody can use the name. It doesn't mean that they've studied her work. It doesn't mean they've had any training. It just means they said, I like the name Montessori. It's very popular right now. It's very trendy. If I put Montessori on my school, if I put Montessori on my business card, it's going to make me sound important and trendy, and it might get me more business. There's a lot of that going on right now. Just taking the name Montessori, slapping it on something, and saying this is what Montessori education is. So let's be very careful about what I'm talking about in terms of Montessori. I am talking about AMI Montessori, the organization that Montessori herself started. This is the training I'm talking about. This is the education system I'm talking about when I'm talking about what's included in the schools. So even if you go to AMI training, there can be vast differences between the schools. Some schools may be inclusive schools or specialty schools, like schools for the deaf. And we have a lot of those. There's a lot more popping up. One example, and if you go back to my video that I just did on special education versus Montessori, I talked about a school called the Elizabeth School, and that's in Utah, and they are really dedicated to inclusive education. They have a history there that's really really special to the school in terms of why they have such an inclusive school and why they do what they do there. So you can have that type of a school. Some Montessori schools are public, and some the public or charter, right? Now, a lot of Montessori public schools are training teachers in the AMI institutes. It's very popular. I think Mint over in Texas, Mint is, let me make sure I remember this right, Montessori Institute of Northern Texas has a lot of a lot of public school teachers are getting trained in AMI Montessori there, particularly in elementary. So there are a lot of public Montessoris popping up, and they are training them in AMI. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole about what I think about that right now, so I'm just going to move on to the next one. Some Montessori schools have school boards, and some have just a sole ownership, just one person in charge of the whole thing, right? Some are an entire school system that go from birth to high school. And some are a small one-room program for one plane of development. Like the school I'm working at right now is a one-room school, and it's just that 3 to 6 age group. And it can be, a very tiny program inside a church, or this elaborate, big, huge campus with an air kinder program. So lots of different ways you can implement the Montessori method. Some Montessori schools have at their center core of it a particular goal. Like one could be a really focused on nature. That could be at the core of their curriculum. Some might be focused on religion. Catholic Montessori schools are very popular. Maria Montessori herself was Catholic. So there are a lot of Catholic, not just Catholic Montessori schools, but Catholic Montessori training programs. So an example of that is I have my master's in Montessori education from Loyola University over in Maryland, and that is a Catholic university. So there are a lot of ties to Catholicism in Montessori. However, that's not necessarily the case, because you'll also see Montessori used in other religions or possibly even cults. And there's even a new Scientology Montessori school opening in Australia. So you have a wide range of use of Montessori. As you can see here, it can be used in a variety of contexts, and that's partly because we train on the materials and the theory and not on a specific textbook, right? So people can take Montessori, and because it's not trademarked, it's not patented, anybody can really use it. And it's pretty wide open for public use. And this is why you really, really, as a parent, have to ask questions about your school, and observing, coming in and observing classrooms, observing the school, seeing what's going on is one of the best ways you can do that, because you really want to see how the teacher works in the classroom. You want to see how the administration responds to the environment. So spending some time in the school observing, which I know wasn't allowed during COVID. Hopefully we're changing that, because parents need to be in the school. They need to be observing. If you're not homeschooling, you need to be in there. You need to be observing. And any school that doesn't allow that, I would question. You have the right to observe your child's school and environment. So instead of textbooks, you're going to find some different things at each plane of development, and I've already talked about some of those. So in primary, we're going to have those picture books and scientific books picked pretty much exclusively by the teacher for the classroom, and that's pretty much based on the teacher's preference. So if the teacher has things that they particularly like or don't like, that's going to change what's in the environment. And the only person that holds the teacher accountable is administration and or the school board, or the public school setting if it's a public school. And then in elementary, it's really the same as the primary, except for we do have those presentations known as the great stories. And those great stories are told orally by the guides. I think we did a puppet show with one of them once, where the students did a puppet show to tell the great stories, and they worked on that. So there's different ways of telling those stories. And I can't really give you more details on that. Maybe someday I'll get an elementary trained person on here and we can go into what those stories are like. But I don't have much more information beyond that. But like I said, children can find their resources from the school library, from the district library within the classroom, or they can bring books in from home to do a lot of different research when they get into the elementary environment or into the older classrooms. And again, because I'm trained in the 3 to 6 environment and not in the older age groups, as far as I understand, for the older age groups, like even middle school, I don't think that textbooks are required by Montessori training. But of course, they might be required by the school system, right? They might be required by the administration, by the school board. They might say this needs to be implemented and that you have to follow this particular path. And from what I have heard, now I don't have a lot of experience talking to people who are trained in the middle school environment, the adolescent age group, but it sounds like a very vague training. They said there's not a lot of order to it. There's not a lot of structure to it. And so you're kind of left going out and putting things together on your own when you're creating that program. And I don't know if that's true or not. And that's just a comment I've heard. So I'm not sure. You might have to ask around to other people to get a better idea of what that environment is like particularly. So what questions do you ask a potential Montessori school? If there's no textbook, how do you know what your child is learning? How do you know what resources they're being given? How do you know what books they're being introduced to? So some of the questions you want to ask if you're evaluating a Montessori school is, do you use textbooks or worksheets unrelated to the AMI materials and training that the guide receives during their AMI training? Like, what are you including in your curriculum outside of the Montessori training? And if you are including textbooks, worksheets, or other curriculums outside of the strict Montessori curriculum, how much of the student's time, how much of their work is spent on these outside materials and curriculums? Really, really ask that question and really push for an answer. Don't let them slide out of it, because if they're not using the materials, if they're not using their training, and I've seen a lot of teachers, especially teachers who really are either burned out or don't have a real appreciation for the Montessori method, slip back into the textbook and worksheet type of thought, right? And we have materials. We have Montessori materials. They should be using those. Those should be the basis. And we should, at the heart of what they're learning, be using that scientific method to really bring about the thoughts into the classroom so the child is flexible to use whatever materials, whatever works are in the classroom. They should not be just tied down to worksheets and textbooks. That should not be happening. The child should be free to explore to the fullest extent and the fullest potential of a subject that they are interested in without any limitations on textbook or one person's particular thought. So this is a really important topic, particularly for elementary age and up. Ask these questions, because when it comes down to it, we don't want the child to have a specific thought taught to them. We want to teach them how to think for themselves, and we want to give them the materials and the resources to dive into any subject. We want to give them the tools to research. We want to give them the method to research. We want to give them the opportunity to self-educate, to auto-educate. And if the teacher is really just clamping down on what the children are learning and say, we're only learning from this book, we're only learning from this person's thought, that's not the Montessori method. And I know that sounds ironic, because when I went to training, I really just studied Montessori's textbooks, right? Her works, her writings. But her writings for teaching, to explain teaching, is to open up the world of scientific education to children. Open up that scientific method to children so that anything in the world, their potentialities, can go anywhere. And so my training taught me that children can go in any direction to learn and to auto-educate, right? We should not be limiting what a child has access to unless it's really inappropriate, right? Obviously, we have to set some boundaries of what we bring into the classroom. So I'm not saying we don't set boundaries, but the process of thought, right, isn't limited to one person's opinion in one textbook. That's more what I'm getting at. And so another question to ask a Montessori school is, how do you choose the textbooks and outside materials that do not come directly from Montessori training? Like, what's the process here? Did the administration and school board research some sort of topic? A good example of this is sex ed curriculum. They tend to choose curriculums because that's not in Montessori training, right? Not that I'm aware of. Usually they bring in a curriculum for that. That's a good example of bringing in a secondary curriculum into the Montessori environment. And outside materials, what outside materials are you bringing in that aren't included in Montessori training? Are there lots of toys? Are there lots of traditional school materials? And if so, why? And are they being used more than the Montessori material? And if so, why is that, right? It's always a good thing to think about. Well, if you're not really using the Montessori materials, and I'll show you where you can look at for Montessori materials and judge by what you see around you. Like, is this a Montessori material or not? That's a good way to know, because if they have a lot of Montessori-ish materials, there's no such thing as Montessori-ish materials. There's Montessori materials, and then there's not Montessori materials. And you have to do a little bit of research to figure out what's the difference, because a lot of people like to slap the word Montessori on something and say, this is a Montessori material. There's a lot of things on Amazon saying they're Montessori materials, they're Montessori toys. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because anybody can use the word Montessori, so we got to do some research here. So anyways, let me go on from that rant. Another question to ask is, will the guide teach any subjects that might conflict with my personal beliefs? If so, how and when will they teach these subjects, and how will I be notified or informed of these lessons? That's another good thing to ask. If you're not somebody who wants sex ed to be included in elementary or primary or even toddler, then you need to speak up about it and ask those questions. If you're somebody who is not a proponent of evolution and you're wondering how do you approach the topic of evolution in Montessori, and where are there opportunities for the child to learn alternative ideas to what Darwin proposed, if that's important to you, you need to ask it. If the school celebrates Ramadan but not Christmas, you need to ask those things, right? You need to ask, how do you approach holidays? How do you approach celebrations within a culture, or learning about it? Can a child do research on Ramadan and the other one do research on Easter? Can you have both of those research topics in the same classroom? And if you have books on one religion, can you have books on a different religion? These are questions to ask because, like I said, Montessori does not have one textbook, and so you're going to want to ask what books are being included in the curriculum, what books are the guides putting in, what collections of books are the guides putting in their classroom, and what books would you like to see in the classroom? And is there room for you to bring in these materials into the classroom, and how will other parents be affected by that, right? It starts to get a little complicated, doesn't it? But these are questions we have to ask. So the last question I would propose is, does the school allow for differences of beliefs or opinions? And if so, how? Right? What does it look like if a parent, child, or even a teacher questions what is being taught? And I think we're seeing a lot of that right now, right? In our culture, in our society, even around the world, not just here in the United States, but around the world. How do we live in a school community where there's differences of opinions, differences of beliefs. And in Montessori school, we are very different. My students are very different. They have very different religions. They look different. They have different languages that they speak. They come from different countries. And so you're going to find a very eclectic classroom. Lots of different interests, lots of different belief systems, all in one place. What does it look like to create harmony in that one space? And of course, I didn't write it down here, but of course, the question of observations is always important. And that should always be on a list for all parents is how and when can I observe the classroom? How and when can I observe all the classrooms, or at least every age level within the school? So those are really important questions. And again, this comes back to me being inspired by the Dark Horse podcast in this clip of no idea is trustworthy because it's written in a textbook. And this is why in the Montessori environment, we should be dedicated to the method of science and not to manufacturing or committing to a specific result of science. The environment should reflect the scientific method. I have an idea, right? That's where it starts. I have an idea. I have a thought. What does it look like to fill in the gaps of these thoughts? What would it look like if I took this thought and I did something with it? And that's really where we're starting with that 3 to 6 age group. I have a thought. What does it look like if I do something with this thought? And as we go into the elementary age groups, we want to continue that. We want to continue that whole process and show the children how to flush it out, how to use that scientific method, how to get lots of different resources at their disposal so that they are not limited to one textbook or one particular thought, but to all the thoughts, putting all the thoughts before them and having them put them together, bring all those thoughts together and have them bring those thoughts into their consciousness, have them think about it and say, okay, you brought all these thoughts together. What do you want to do about that? What would it look like to do something about that? And really get that scientific method, that scientific education back into the forefront, not to be committed to the result of science. I mean, there are scientific truths, right? We're going to teach physics. We're going to teach, the parts of a plant, the parts of a horse. We're going to teach that type of biology, but we're not going to limit it there, right? We're going to keep evolving. We're going to keep layering it. And so when we're looking at a classroom that follows the scientific education, I think this video really, the Dark Horse podcast video, really brought to life what I love about Montessori. Now, Montessori in the hands of somebody who's untrained or somebody who has a particular thought that's committed to a particular result and not the scientific method, it's still going to be very damaging and very limiting, right? Because at the heart of it, it comes back to the teacher presenting to the child, presenting to the student. And if the teacher doesn't present the method of science to the students, then they will not understand that method. They won't fulfill those potentialities. And that's the difference between education and indoctrination, right? If we're actually allowing the child to learn, or are we asking the child to just repeat a thought that we're telling them to repeat? So we want the children to think for themselves. We want to train them up to have the ability to think for themselves and to collect all the thoughts, any of the thoughts, and do something with them. And that should be at the heart of education, of scientific education. And while I'm at it, let me pause for just a second while I bring up some websites that can show you more about what are Montessori materials so that you can start to understand what might not be Montessori materials. So I'm going to pause for a moment while I bring up my Google browser. Right, so here we are at Neen House. Now, this is pretty much, it's very, very, very expensive. I'm going to warn you right now, there are places to get cheaper materials, but as far as what are the Montessori materials, this is a good website to use as a reference. And they also have some workshops and webinars and stuff like that. And so you're going to, let's take a look at mathematics. You're going to see here a lot of Montessori materials. So when you go on to, let's say, Amazon, or if you're observing in a classroom, you're like, is that a Montessori material or is it not? And like the 100 board you might not see because 100 board it was discontinued from my training. I actually don't mind the 100 board. I think there's some children who really benefit from this work. It can be, I've seen it be a very therapeutic work for some children. And so we have a lot of things right here. Let's see what they list for biology. We've got the botany cabinet and puzzles, right? We actually don't, I mean, technically I don't have this in my album, but we have them in all the Montessori environments. So if you're looking at what resources you want to include, and again, like some of the stuff for biology and science, they're not official AMI presentations, but those biology is one of those where you do have to kind of bring in your own materials or make your own materials. It's an extension really of the botany cabinet, for example, you'll find in the sensorial area, there isn't a biology area in the classroom. This is because we give the sensorial impression of the leaves in the 3 to 6 age group. And then let's take a little look at math in the elementary group. We still have the golden bead system because some of our children really need that concrete stuff. Place value working mat. Yep. Let's see. We have here, I'm going to try to find something. We have the bead chains, which we also have. The hierarchical works right here that go up to 1,000,000. That is an official one. I don't know the circle of operations because I'm primary trained. I haven't even seen that one. That's one I don't know. Bead system still very important. And then we've got that's all stuff I have in primary as well. That's Pythagoras board. Large bead frame we have in the primary environment. Checkerboard is one I see a lot in the elementary environment. So again, in the elementary environment, when it comes to math, we're not using textbooks, we're using materials. So look through here, look at a lot of stuff. And then, if you have more questions and you say, you know what, I see this material on the shelf. Where does that fall in the Montessori curriculum in your Montessori training? And why is that one included? What's the purpose of it? Feel free to ask all those questions. All those questions are really, really important. So anyways, that's about all I have for you right now. And so I gave you the long answer of what does Montessori use? Do they use textbooks? Do they not use textbooks? And again, they can. But if you're looking at authentic Montessori training, which tends to be more of the AMI training, that really gets into the theory of Montessori and the theory of the materials, not just how to use the materials, but the theory behind it, where as far as I've seen, AMI is the only one that really does that. And if you have the theory, it opens you up to a whole new world of what can I do with these materials? What's purposeful with the materials? And it comes back to that material education, that we are experiencing the mathematical mind. We are experiencing the scientific method. And we're not just being taught somebody's thought and implanting that thought into their brain and having them repeat that thought. We want them to think for themselves. We want them to be independent. And that should be at the heart of whatever Montessori school you choose or whatever you're deciding to do with your homeschool program. Bringing it back to independent thought is really where we want to start. So anyways, I hope you've liked this video. I hope that this was interesting or gives you some insight or gives you some questions to ask for deciding the future of the education for your child or for maybe even your students. So anyways, if you did like this, give it a thumbs up, like, share, comment, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.